The waiter walked over, placed a single card in the middle of the Thanksgiving table, and said, "A note from the owner." My mother reached for it, but my brother opened it first. He read it out loud, slowly. "This home belongs to the one you left off the guest list. Enjoy the warmth." Hi, I'm Emily, the youngest, the quiet one, the one they thought they could erase with a group text and a fake smile. I didn't crash the party. I just let them celebrate. Under my roof. And trust me, that one sentence, it changed everything. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to get to know you a little better. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. That way I can send you a special shout out. Now, let's begin our story together. You brought that store pie again? Sophie laughed, loud enough for the whole room. I froze for a second, my fork hovering over the salad bowl. The air around the table didn't shift much. Just a couple of chuckles, a glance from Dad that didn't quite reach me, and the clink of someone adjusting their glass. No one said a word in my defense. I forced a smile, the kind that didn't wrinkle my eyes, and set the fork back down. "It's from Greenhouse Bakery," I said softly. "Made fresh this morning." "Oh," Sophie replied, as if I'd mentioned a generic gas station. Then she turned back to describing her latest trip to Charleston, where she'd discovered this life-changing corn souffle and a boutique that sold linen napkins dyed with avocado pits. Thanksgiving always looked picture-perfect in our house. My mother had a way of curating tradition like it was part of her personal brand. White dishes with gold trim, hand-lettered place cards, candles that smelled like cinnamon and effort. She ran the day like a silent production, choreographed to imply spontaneity. Behind it all, though, was that quiet hierarchy. Sophie on top, Jacob steady in the middle, me the afterthought. I'd arrived with my pie in a glass dish, still warm, wrapped in a blue and white checkered towel. No one had greeted me at the door. Mom had waved from the kitchen without looking up. Dad had mumbled something about traffic. Sophie, already perched in the living room with a glass of wine, greeted me with a quick, "Oh, you made it," like I'd wandered in from the cold instead of being part of the family. The pie was set to the sideboard where it would spend the next 3 hours untouched. Dinner began with the usual, Margaret carving the turkey while pretending to defer to Walter. He cleared his throat and handed her the knife with mock ceremony. She pretended not to enjoy it. Diane sat next to me, unusually quiet, her gaze darting back and forth like she was watching a tennis match played entirely in passive-aggressive volleys. When Margaret complimented Sophie's stuffing, dry and over-salted, but beautifully presented in a ceramic dish, I felt something tighten behind my ribcage. "You really outdid yourself," she beamed. "This feels gourmet." I waited. Nothing came my way. After a few minutes of silence, I spoke. "I'd love to help plan next year's dinner, or at least bring something more substantial." Margaret didn't even look up. "We've got a good system going, sweetie," she said, cutting into the turkey. "Why complicate it?" Sophie laughed lightly. "Besides, you've got your job and your place up north. You're probably busy." Busy. That word again. A catch-all excuse for distance. I swallowed the reply forming at the back of my throat. Jacob cleared his throat. "How's work going, Em?" he asked, trying maybe. "It's steady," I said, glad someone had asked. "My firm just opened a new satellite office in Burlington." Margaret lifted her wine. "That's lovely, dear. I keep hearing good things about Vermont. Very quiet." The meal continued. Conversations overlapped. Vacation plans were casually mentioned. Sophie and Mom were thinking about Palm Springs in March. Jacob might do a guys' fishing weekend with Dad and Uncle Charles. No one looked in my direction. No one asked if I had plans or wanted to join. A bottle of wine passed around the table. It skipped over me, not out of malice, just like I wasn't there. Diane noticed, reached across, and poured me a glass without a word. It was almost funny how invisible I'd become. After dessert was set out, I waited for someone to suggest trying the pie. My pie. It sat there perfectly intact, untouched like a vase meant for display. Sophie's store-bought cheesecake had already been picked over. Someone made a joke about how it wasn't Thanksgiving without her classic Costco treat. No one mentioned the pie I'd brought in with care, tucked in a towel that still smelled faintly of my laundry detergent. I stood quietly, picked up my coat from the chair in the hall, and slipped it over my shoulders. The hallway mirror caught my reflection, half-lit, distant. I took one last glance at the dining room before walking toward the door. "Emily?" Dad called, surprised. "You're leaving." "Yeah," I said simply. "Long drive back." Margaret's head tilted slightly. "You're not staying for coffee." I smiled faintly. "I think I've had enough." No one followed me out. No one asked me to stay. I stepped into the cold, the night sharper than I expected. The warmth of the house still glowed behind the windows, flickering against the snow-dusted shrubs. My breath fogged the air as I opened my car door and sat in silence for a few minutes before starting the engine. The pie was still inside. I drove away without it. I didn't realize it then, but that was my final seat at their table. The text came in while I was pouring hot water over a tea bag. Steam rose, curling into the air like the question itself. "Wait, are you actually coming this year?" Jacob had written. "Mom said you weren't." I stared at the screen for a second, letting the words settle. Then I scrolled back through the family group thread. There were photos of a turkey centerpiece, a short video of Sophie modeling a new winter coat, and Margaret reminding everyone not to forget the sweet potatoes. My name hadn't come up once, not even in passing. The pine candle on my counter flickered. I sat down on the bar stool, still holding my phone. I hadn't been told anything. I tapped out a reply. I hadn't heard I wasn't, but thanks for the heads up. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then nothing. It was only October, but Vermont already felt like late November. Quiet, cool, deliberate. My apartment was small but warm, the kind of place I'd once dreamed of when I lived in the attic back home. My own dishes, my own furniture. I had a bookshelf that smelled faintly of lemon oil, and a couch just soft enough to fall asleep on. I'd carved a corner of peace for myself, but that text from Jacob, it carved something else, something sharper. 2 weeks earlier, I'd sent $1,500 to Margaret. She had mentioned needing help with holiday logistics on a call that felt more like a transaction. I had sent the money with a short note. "Hope this makes things easier." No response. No thank you, just silence. So I called. Margaret picked up on the 4th ring. "Hello?" "Hey, Mom, quick question. Am I not invited this year?" She paused. Just long enough. "Oh, honey, it's just that we're keeping it simple. Immediate family only." "I am immediate family." Another pause. Longer. "We just thought it might be easier, less tension." "Tension?" I repeated. "Well," she said carefully, "Sophie's been through a lot, and your father's not feeling his best. We didn't want to overcomplicate." Overcomplicate? I nearly laughed. I'd paid for a dinner I wasn't allowed to attend, and I was the complication. "I understand," I said, but I didn't. We hung up. I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, hands cold. Then I opened my laptop. The estate in Stowe wasn't hard to find. Margaret had talked about it before, how charming it was, how she was considering renting it this year. Rustic beams, mountain views, catered kitchen. On a whim, I checked the property's availability. Still open. It was expensive, very expensive. I stared at the listing a while, long enough for my tea to go cold. The next morning at work, I mentioned it to Lauren during our coffee break. We were sitting by the window watching the first real snow dust the parking lot. "They're holding Thanksgiving without you?" she asked, squinting. I nodded. "But you paid for it?" I nodded again. She leaned back. "So rent out the whole damn place before they do." I blinked. "I'm serious," she said. "Don't fight them, just outplay them." It wasn't said in anger. It was said in clarity. A simple equation. If I was going to be left out, I might as well own the room they celebrated in. That night, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop again. I made a few calls. Used the LLC I'd created years ago for freelance consulting work, Hartwell and Wild, a name no one in the family would recognize. I signed the paperwork electronically. By the end of the week, the estate was mine for the entire holiday weekend. I didn't tell anyone, didn't gloat, didn't drop hints. I just let the silence stretch, like they had. The snow outside deepened. I folded the confirmation email into a new folder marked Personal, then shut my laptop. They had planned to cut me out, so I let them. But this time, they'd be doing it under my roof. "Oh, the lighting in here is just stunning," I heard my mother say, her voice crisp through the security feed. She was holding a glass of wine, dressed in her usual cream cashmere and pearls. It better be, for that price. The camera angle from the main hallway showed the high ceilings I had fallen in love with the moment I saw them. The way the afternoon light spilled through the tall windows, warming the walnut floors and dancing off the brushed brass fixtures. I had stood in that exact entryway just weeks before, silently imagining how they'd react if they knew. They didn't. From my living room in Burlington, I sat cross-legged on the couch, laptop open in front of me. I had set up the stream earlier with the estate staff, who thought I was simply an out-of-town owner wanting to check in. The head server, David, had even given me a quiet wave to the camera when they began prepping. It was Thanksgiving Day, and my family was celebrating inside a home I owned, thinking it was just another high-end rental. Margaret floated through the dining area, commenting on the crown molding and the hand-blown glass chandelier, like she'd selected every detail herself. I watched her finger trace the edge of a menu card, which bore the discreet H&W Holdings logo at the bottom. No one seemed to notice. Sophie was already seated at the table, arranging her napkin just so. Her laughter carried across the room, too loud for the setting. She complimented the floral arrangement in the foyer and mentioned to someone off-screen how this year's dinner just felt more elegant. My brother Jacob stood near the drink station, looking slightly out of place. His tie wasn't quite straight, and he kept adjusting it. I leaned back into the couch, feeling the soft pressure of my dog's head resting against my ankle. Even he seemed to understand the moment. It wasn't revenge I felt. It wasn't even satisfaction. Just stillness. For years, I had asked to be seen. I had brought dishes, offered help, paid bills I wasn't supposed to cover, and yet I had always been met with that same quiet dismissal, brushed off like lint on a sleeve. When I bought my condo, Margaret had wrinkled her nose and called it shabby, said the exposed brick looked like an unfinished project. She had never visited. But here she was, sipping wine beneath beams I had paid to restore, raving about a home she believed had nothing to do with me. The dinner itself was catered, of course. Margaret would never bother with stuffing a turkey on her own. The servers moved in quiet rhythm, setting dishes with precision. The table sparkled with golden flatware, linen runners, and flickering candles. David, the head server, stood at attention near the kitchen. He was tall and calm, with the kind of grace that made you trust he could manage any tension before it escalated. As they began dessert, he stepped forward with a silver tray. On it sat a small envelope, cream-colored, sealed, unmarked. He waited until the plates were cleared. Then, with a subtle bow, he placed the envelope in the center of the table and said, "A note from the owner." Silence settled. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Margaret reached out, but Jacob's hand was quicker. He opened it. The camera didn't show his face directly, but I saw his shoulders stiffen. He read aloud, "Dear friend, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I bet you can't guess what's coming next. But before we go any further, drop a 5 in the comments if you're still with me, because what happens next might just leave you speechless. This home belongs to the one you left off the guest list. Enjoy the warmth." There it was. Not dramatic, not cruel, just true. Sophie let out a short, dry laugh. "Wait, what?" No one answered. Margaret's lips parted slightly, her expression frozen mid-sip. Her eyes darted around the table as if searching for something or someone to make sense of it. Jacob slowly lowered the card. His gaze drifted toward the chandelier above them, then toward the kitchen. He didn't say anything. I watched from my living room, the mug of tea in my hands warming slowly. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat with the stillness of it all. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step out of the room and let the truth take your place. Back at the estate, the camera showed the family sitting in stunned silence. A server poured more coffee, her hands steady despite the shift in mood. Diane, seated at the far end, looked down at her napkin, then glanced toward Jacob. No one moved. Sophie's fork slipped from her hand and hit her plate with a soft clink. Margaret turned pale. And Jacob? Jacob stood, envelope still in hand, and slowly pulled out his phone. I didn't need to see what he typed. I knew it was meant for me. Wait, what? Sophie's voice dropped low, as if she were afraid the card in Jacob's hand might hear her. She stared at it like it might catch fire. No one moved. Margaret blinked once, then again. Her wine glass wobbled slightly in her hand. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply, breaking the silence. "It's obviously a joke." Jacob didn't respond. He just kept reading the card over again, his eyes tracking the single sentence, like he was waiting for it to change. Sophie reached for her phone. "Maybe it's from the catering company," she muttered. "Some stupid promotion." Diane looked across the table, her gaze settling on Jacob. She didn't speak, just folded her napkin slowly and placed it on her lap like she was preparing for the real dinner to begin. Walter shifted in his chair. "What did it say again?" Jacob cleared his throat, but his voice was quiet. "It says, 'This house belongs to the one you left off the guest list. Enjoy the warmth.'" Signed E. Margaret stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape against the hardwood. "No," she said. No, that's not possible." She turned to David, the head server, who had stepped back toward the kitchen with the composure of a man who had seen plenty but commented on little. "You," Margaret snapped. "Who owns this house?" David didn't flinch. "It's registered under H&W Holdings," he said evenly. "And who is that?" Sophie asked, arms folded tight. He paused, glancing between them. "Emily Hartwell." The name landed like a dropped glass. Margaret scoffed. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking, ma'am," David said. "She's unstable," Margaret said, voice rising. "You don't know her. She's always been dramatic, vindictive." Diane raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Walter looked at the ceiling as if searching for something written in the crown molding. Sophie let out a short, breathy laugh. "I mean, it's not like she planned this, right? She couldn't have known we'd booked this place." Jacob finally looked up from the card. "No," he said softly. "She didn't plan it. She made it happen." Margaret whipped around. "What does that mean?" "It means," Jacob replied, tapping the card once, "she didn't get mad. She got quiet. And she got smart." Sophie rolled her eyes. "Come on, Jake. Don't make this about her being some kind of genius." "No," he said again. "But maybe it's about us not listening for a long time." The air thickened. The warmth of the room started to feel heavy instead of cozy. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and slow against the wide glass windows. Margaret turned back to David. "We're leaving." "You've paid for the full weekend," he reminded her politely. "We don't want it anymore." "That's your decision, ma'am, but the house is yours to use until Monday." She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse from the back of the chair, her hands shaking just enough to rattle the contents. She stormed down the hallway, heels clacking too loud against the polished wood. Sophie picked up her napkin and flung it onto the plate like it had personally offended her. "This is insane," she muttered. "We invite her every year, and she always acts like she's doing us a favor." Diane looked at her calmly. "Did we invite her this year?" No one answered. Jacob reached for his phone. I was sitting on my couch again, legs tucked under me, tea in hand. I saw the message come through. "Jacob." "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I thought for a moment. Then I typed back, "Me, I know. I just wanted you to know." Back at the estate, Jacob stared at his phone for a few long seconds. Then he quietly deleted the thread. Diane leaned in slightly and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "She had every right." He didn't argue. His face had changed. "You humiliated your mother," Dad said, his voice tight over the phone, in front of everyone. I didn't answer right away. The steam from my coffee curled upward in delicate spirals. I watched it disappear near the window, where snow pressed softly against the glass, like a quiet reminder that the world, no matter how chaotic inside, kept moving out there. "She's not eating," he added after a pause. "She locked herself in the bedroom, says she can't even look at her phone." I took a slow sip. "I paid for years of her dinners," I said, voice steady. "This was just one meal she didn't control." Dad sighed, a long, weary sound that echoed more from habit than heart. "Emily." I stood and walked to the window, cradling the mug between both hands. From here, I could see the street lamps casting soft pools of light over the snow-dusted cars. The world looked calm, cleaner even. "She's calling everyone," he said, lower now. "Telling people you've had an episode." My grip tightened on the mug, but I didn't say anything. "Not yet. She said you've been under pressure, that this whole thing was out of character, that you need help." Of course she did. That was Margaret's way. If she couldn't control the story, she'd control the storyteller, paint the canvas in her colors, even if it meant using a version of me that never existed. "Dad," I said gently, "I'm fine. But I'm not going to make her feel better for what she did. I just want peace," he said. "So do I replied. "And sometimes peace looks like silence." After we hung up, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the couch. The TV was off. The room was quiet except for the occasional pop of the radiator. I glanced at my phone. Missed call from Aunt Diane, a voicemail I wasn't ready to listen to. Then a text came through. "Jacob, she's telling people you had a breakdown." A moment later, "Jacob, I don't believe it." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed, "Me, then say so." 3 dots blinked, then stopped. I knew how these things worked. Margaret wasn't loud with her attacks. She was efficient. She used concern like a weapon, talking in worried tones to cousins, sprinkling phrases like fragile and "we've all been worried for a while." It didn't take much. A sentence here, a raised eyebrow there, enough to make people wonder, enough to shift the burden of proof onto me. I stood up, stretched, and walked into the kitchen. The fridge hummed softly. I pulled out a container of soup, warmed it, then sat again in silence. I didn't feel broken. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt done. That night, after the soup, after the dishes were clean, and after I'd lit a new candle by the window, I opened the family group chat. I kept the message short, no drama, no lecture. Me, no breakdown, just boundaries. "I'm okay. Hope you are too." I hit send. Then I muted the conversation and tossed the phone to the other end of the couch. It wasn't a victory, it was a choice. I was no longer playing the role they'd written for me. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it slowly. Jacob stood there, holding 2 paper cups. His coat was dusted with snow. His eyes looked tired, unsure. He didn't say a word. I stepped aside to let him in. Sometimes the apology doesn't come in sentences. It just shows up holding coffee. "I spent years trying to earn a seat at a table I didn't build," I said, gently swirling the coffee cup in my hand. "Now I'm building my own." Jacob sat across from me, the light from the window glinting off his half-cold paper coffee cup. Outside, snow fell quietly. Inside the cafe, everything carried the warmth of a January morning. The pastry counter brimming with freshly baked waffles, soft jazz humming from the corner, and strangers murmuring over steaming tea. "Mom always said you didn't belong in the middle of things," he said after a pause, "and we just went along with that." I didn't nod, didn't disagree. Some things don't need confirmation. They just need to be said so someone can realize they once existed. I let her define you, Jacob continued, and I let her define me too, if I'm honest. I looked at my brother, the one who'd always been quietly there but rarely spoke up. Today, he wasn't blaming, wasn't justifying, just speaking the truth. Diane told me, he said, that sometimes bravery just looks like being willing to see someone differently. I think she was right. I smiled, not big, but enough for him to know I was listening. We talked a bit more, about work, about the snow, about Lauren and the waffle she once mailed me after Thanksgiving. No one mentioned Margaret. No one needed to. When we stood to leave the cafe, I didn't say, "Come over sometime," or "See you soon." I just placed a hand on his shoulder lightly. "Take care of yourself, Jake." He nodded. "You too, Em." I turned and stepped out of the cafe, not as cold as I'd expected. The phone stayed quiet in my pocket, no longer a lifeline I clung to for validation. I didn't need to know how many people understood me. I just needed to understand myself. A soft breeze swept through, swirling the snow into a small trail along the path. On my way home, I passed a small bakery. A handwritten sign hung in the window. "Now hiring, part-time mornings. Apply inside." I stopped, peered in. A young woman was wiping down the counter, trays of fresh waffles behind her, the scent of cinnamon and butter drifting into the air. I smiled. Not because I needed the job, but because I knew if I walked in there tomorrow, it would be my choice. Not to be seen, but because I'd chosen to see myself. I don't know what I'll do tomorrow, but for the first time in years, that doesn't scare me. Because I've learned that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stop trying to be accepted and start living true to ourselves. Family isn't just blood. It's where there's listening, respect, and space to be yourself. And in a world full of noise, sometimes silence is the clearest answer of all. If this story makes you think of a table you were once pushed away from, or a place you've learned to rebuild from scratch, share your thoughts. I'll always be listening from the other side of these words.